Okay, we've reached our first improvising lesson for this level. Now, at this point, you know that it's all up to you. It's about choice, it's about flavor, it's about personality. Do I want to play inside? Do I want to play outside? Do I want to sound real jazzy? Do I want to sound more bluesy? What kind of player do you want to sound like? That's what it all comes down to. We've learned a multitude of scales, a multitude of chords. They all have the little intricacies, little things that are different, and they all have little different functions. And so it's up to you as the improviser, as the soloist, as the writer of the tune as well, to make choices because you want that choice, and then to play over it, accentuating that choice. Everything is on purpose. Now, there's two things that you want to keep in mind. There's two approaches that are constantly going to be going back and forth, and you got to find your middle ground. How much do you want of this, and how much do you want of that? That's a key center approach versus a chord scale approach. A key center approach, very easy to understand. If we're in the key of C, you have a bunch of different chords in the progression, but they all relate back to C. So for each different chord, you're going to be playing a C something. Everything's going to be about C. A chord scale approach is I have a different scale for each chord. Yeah, it is going to relate back to my tonic, here or there, but basically I'm thinking this chord performs this function, I'm going to make it perform that function big time. It's going to be all about that chord's function, and the next chord is going to be all about that chord. So for each individual chord, it's each individual moment in time. That's chord scale thinking. First place to start, we're going to start at the beginning of this level with modal interchange. With modal interchange, if you remember, we're borrowing chords from parallel modes. Now, I asked you to solo over this when you created your video, but I didn't really tell you how to do it. Hopefully, you picked up on the fact that if you're borrowing a chord from a parallel mode, when you get to that chord, you're going to play that parallel mode over that borrowed chord. So if you're in C major, and then you borrow a chord from C minor, you literally switch to C minor for that chord, then back to C major, and it gives the sound of that overall key center changing from a major tonality to a minor tonality, and then back. That's your main basic purpose of modal interchange. The next thing we spoke about was secondary dominance. Now, if you remember, a secondary dominant is a functioning dominant chord, but it can resolve to either a major or minor or another dominant chord. Now, we have gone over quite a few different dominant scale shapes, but there are a couple worth mentioning where it resolves much better in different scenarios. If you are creating a chord that has a specific kind of tension, you want to resolve it in that specific way to resolve it in the correct way. So if we have a dominant 7th chord, which resolves to a major chord, our first two obvious choices are Mixolydian, because that's your obvious diatonic choice, and then Lydian dominant, because we know Lydian's got that super bright sound, it's got the dominant chord in there, but it's also got that sharp 11. So especially when you see a dominant chord with a sharp 11 in it, boom, Lydian dominant. You don't even want to hesitate. You see a sharp 11 in a dominant chord, you think Lydian dominant all day. You just go for it. But what about if your dominant 7th chord is resolving to a minor chord, minor 7th chord, or some kind of minor tonality? This is when harmonic minor really kicks in, and your altered scale. Harmonic minor, remember, has that major 7, so that's that leading tone. That's the major third of the 5 chords. It's really, really going to pull back to the root, to the tonic, and really resolve that tritone dissonance, that you're going to get. The altered, even more so. It's going to be even more dissonant. So when you resolve to it, it's going to be even more resolved and more exaggerated. The last thing we want to talk about before we play a little is chord tones. Always be mindful of chord tones. Here's the basic thing about chord tones. When you choose a chord, you're choosing it for that specific purpose. When you alter chord tones, when you add a sharp 11 or flat 9 or something like that, it's for a purpose. You're doing it on purpose, right? So when you are picking a scale to play over it, whether it's a chord scale approach or a key center approach, you want to make sure to accentuate whatever you've chosen the context to be. It's very important to understand. Now, the obvious question is, Well, what if I don't know the context? I didn't write it, and I'm not really sure. 90% of the time, you can look back in your progression, see what came before it. What chord tones were in the scale before it, or in that chord that preceded it. Because as a general rule of thumb, whatever's already been played or is already ringing wants to kind of continue through. So if you see you have a flat 9 in the chord before, but in your current chord it doesn't say anything about the 9, well, you might want to do an altered scale instead of, say, a harmonic minor scale, because it says it in the previous chord. Now, you don't have to, but that normally makes the most sense. The last thing I'm going to say is about the leading tone. The leading tone, again, the major 7th. You're a half step below whatever root you're going to next. The leading tone always wins. You can always play behind a tone. You can always play right behind. If you try to play right in front of it, it's never really going to fly. It's going to be too dissonant. So if you really want to push to the next change, you can always throw a leading tone out there, and you'll find that that leading tone is usually in either your harmonic minor scale, your altered scale, your Lydian dominant, your melodic minor. You just have to decide if that's for you. What sound do you want? Do you really want that strong pull? Okay, so now let's play a little bit. I have a jam track here, which I've plugged in, and we're going to do it in the key of A. So I did A major, and then D minor. We go back to A major, and then it's G major, and then E7. So, a few ways of looking at this, right? If we do a key-centered approach, this is a 1 major, 4 minor, flat 7 major, 5 dominant, right? Now, you could also, for each chord, you can kind of do its own scale or its own arpeggio, right? You could say something about A major, then go right for a D minor sound, then right for a G major sound, right for an E7 sound. In fact, what I recommend is that when you post your video doing this, and again, you can go over a different progression. I encourage you to make up your own progression where you kind of experiment with a couple of these different options, where the first time through, maybe keep it simple, keep it real chord scale-like. Maybe the second time through, make it more where you're doing an arpeggio for each one. The third time through, maybe, go a little nuts with it. Kind of experiment. So take your time, practice it a lot before you post your video. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit my loop, and I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to play a little different each time through, kind of play up and down the neck, experiment with a bunch of different options, and kind of show you the way, I like to navigate. But again, some people will sound way more outside than this, or way more inside, or way more simple, or way more complex. The idea right here is not to really, is not to really go crazy with it to the point where you're just kind of burning around and you're not really saying anything. You still want to try to say something about each chord, but try to make, even though it's non-diatonic, try to make all your stuff linear. Try to make it connect, and try to use it in a tasteful way. So I'm going to play a little bit, and I'm very excited to see what you come up with.